Recently, I conducted a study with over 20,000 dogs of different species from all over the world. 10,000 of these dogs had personalized dog signs on their dog houses. The other 10,000 did not. The study concluded that the 10,000 dogs that did have a sign are more confident, much happier, and lived longer lives than their non-sign possessing counterparts. This was a true story that this was a study. It was real. It was written in a medical journal. Okay, so I didn't really conduct that study. But wooden sign making is fun to do, and it's a lot easier than you may think. In addition, you can alter the process to match the tools that you have available to you. I made this sign for the doghouse that I built in our last video. The tools you'll need are a router. You can use a full-size router like this, you can use a trim router, or you could even use a rotary tool. I've heard of a lot of people having really good success with rotary tools. I haven't used it myself, so I can't comment on that. But in addition, you'll need a few bits. You'll need an 1/8 inch and a 1/16 inch flute cutting bits. If you plan on putting a decorative edge around your sign, you'll need a bit to do that as well. You'll need a pencil and an X-Acto blade. You'll also need an electric sander. If you don't have an electric sander, you can use the good old sanding block. We'll need something to cut our sign out with. I have a jigsaw. If you have a bandsaw or a scroll saw, those will work as well. If you have a scroll saw, you might want to veer a little bit further away from that line so that you don't cut into your sign. Finally, for tools, we'll need a paintbrush. We need to apply our finish to our sign. What? Paintbrush. And that's all we need for our tools. For our supplies, we're going to need paper, carbon paper, paint. I would suggest using spray paint, but you could use any paint. For my example in this video, I used this paint, which I used as trim on the doghouse that this sign is going on. If your sign is going to go outside, you may want to protect it with some spar urethane varnish. You'll need some tape. Any clear tape will do. I'm using Scotch tape, as long as it's not too rigid that the carbon paper won't pick up on your pencil marks. And finally, you'll need your stock. So with that, that's everything we need. Let's go to the computer and get it started.
To start, I designed my sign in Adobe Illustrator. Since you may not have Illustrator, I won't go into detail on how to use it. And if you do have it, chances are you know how to use it. I don't want you to get caught up in the idea that you need Illustrator to make this sign, because you don't. You can use Corel Draw, Photoshop, heck, you can use Word if you want. Even if you want to be more hands-on, you could even draw this out on a piece of paper. My point is, you don't even need a computer to accomplish this part. So once you get your design final, you'll need to print it out in a specific way. You'll need to print it in a way that all of the imageable area is printed out. And what that means is that when it prints out, you'll be able to cut the margins away and not lose any of the design. In Adobe Illustrator, the print dialog box, down in the options section, you have a drop down here for scaling. The trick here is yours is probably set on do not scale. You want to set this to tile imageable areas. And what that does is print it out, compensating for the margin in the printed documents. So if you were to use something like tile full pages, as you can see, it shows you that it actually prints the image, or it only prints what's inside the printable area, but it doesn't compensate for the margins, so you get this blank spot at the edge of the pages with missing information. So set it to tile imageable areas and print it out. If you're using another program, you'll want to see if there is a similar setting in the print dialog that will print the same results. If not, one way you might accomplish the same thing is to print part of the design on one sheet and print the remainder on another sheet, with some overlapping so that you can trim away the excess to get it just right. Now with the design printed out, we need to turn our sheets into a sheet. First, we need to trim away the margins. This applies if you don't have borderless printing. With margins removed, we now need to bind the pieces together using Scotch tape. You can use any clear tape as long as you can see through it and it's not so rigid that the carbon paper won't pick up on your pencil when you pass over it. Trim away any excess blank white paper above the design. Ensure there is about 1/2 inch above the highest point in your design and that the trim line is cut straight. Now with your board sitting underneath your design, locate where in the board you want your sign to lay. Try to avoid using a board with knots, or at least position the knots away from any of the design cuts or design features. Once you find your location, run a length of Scotch tape along the top of the design onto your board. Place some carbon paper between the design and the board, dark side against the board. Now start tracing. Don't worry about filling in the letters, we only care about the edges. Work your way through the whole design, moving the design as little as possible. Using a straight edge whenever you can never hurts. With our 16th inch flute cutting bit in our router and set to a depth of about 1/8 of an inch, we can get to work. When plunging into the work, aim away from the edge to get a feel for how the router reacts to the wood. Now follow the design. Don't worry about taking out any of the center material yet. We'll get to that after we get the outline done. At this point, your fingers might be a little bit tingly. Now with our 1/8 inch bit in our router, we can go back and hog out the rest of the material that we left inside our letters. Finally, we go over the entire sign with a chisel, carefully sharpening up the corners and cleaning up the lines. Using my jigsaw, I cut the sign shape out, being careful to stay just outside the line. To finish the shaping process, I use my oscillating spindle sander to clean up the edges. This tool is one of my favorite to own, but if you don't have one, you can use a random orbit sander or a sanding block. I'm using 80 grit to get the design down to the line. Then I throw on the 220 grit sleeve to smooth it all out. Here I change to a smaller sleeve to conform to the inside corners of the design. With the 220 grit sleeve on, I also knocked down the edges since I didn't want a decorative edge. Quickly go over the sign with some 80 grit sandpaper. Now clean any dust off the sign and apply your paint. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm using the paint that I used for the trim on the doghouse that this sign is going on. But I suggest if you are not doing the same thing as I am to use spray paint here. After the paint dries, pull out the sandpaper and get to work. I started with 80 grit and then I moved on to 220. Here I applied some mineral spirits just to get an idea of what it'll look like with the finish. A finish is not required if this is going indoors, but if you're going to put this outdoors, I highly suggest using a spar urethane varnish, which here I am using Varathane Spar Urethane Clear. I put on 3 coats of varnish, sanding with 400 grit sandpaper in between each coat. I applied the urethane with some cheesecloth balled up inside a cotton rag. A brush would apply the urethane thicker, so it's up to you to choose your favorite method. The last step is to attach our hardware and call it a day.